The stars outside the observation deck shimmered like spilled diamonds across black velvet, but the Queen barely noticed. She moved through the corridors of her flagship with the precision of a machine, her long ears brushing the edges of doorways, catching the hum of the gravlifts and the faint static of distant communications. Every step was deliberate, a calculation of power, presence, and intimidation. Her crew kept their distance, not out of fear alone, but out of habit. They had learned that proximity to the Queen could be as dangerous as standing in the path of a plasma cannon. The human soldier, however, moved with an entirely different rhythm, tripping over corners, mumbling under his breath, and occasionally bumping into the wall with a soft oof. The Queen paused mid-step, one eyebrow arched so perfectly it could have been etched by the finest nanoblade sculptors in the galaxy. "You might consider, oh, I don't know, using the handrails," she said, her voice calm but laced with the subtle authority that had ended wars. The human glanced up, cheeks coloring in a way that reminded her vaguely of some Earth creature whose name she could never quite remember. "Yes, Your Highness," he said, and nearly stumbled again, catching himself on the wrong side of a control panel. The Queen exhaled in a manner that was almost laughter, though it manifested as a tiny spark of air moving through her long ears. She had ruled systems where planets had surrendered before their cities were fully constructed, where fleets had folded under her glare. And yet here she was, mildly entertained by a human's inability to walk straight. They reached the observation deck together, though "together" was a generous term. The human shuffled forward, occasionally glancing at the holographic star map projected above the railing. "I think this nebula looks like, well, like cotton candy," he said, and there was no hesitation in the absurdity, no diplomacy, no cautious praise. He simply stated it as a fact, as if cotton candy had ever mattered in galactic conquest. The Queen turned sharply, eyes narrowing with what should have been disdain, but what came out was something entirely unexpected. "Cotton candy?" she asked. "Yes," he said, unwavering. "Kind of the pink swirl with sparkles, if you imagine it in zero gravity." He paused, blinking at her, entirely unaware of how dangerously close he had come to dismantling her carefully maintained aura. She felt a tickle in her chest, the kind she would have filed under anomalies in any planetary survey. A tiny, unfamiliar warmth. She tilted her head, and one ear twitched in a way she did not know she could control. "You find humor in trivialities," she said, more as a statement than a question. He smiled. "I find humor in everything that doesn't explode. Well, except when it does explode. Then it's more like shock therapy." He shrugged. The Queen's lips twitched. A corner of her mouth lifted, almost against her will. The conversation could have ended there had the cosmos been kind, but the human decided to continue. "Also the view," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the nebula, "it makes your ears look elegant, like they're listening to the music of the stars or something." He didn't flinch when he said it. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to calculate the danger of complimenting the galaxy's most feared ruler. The Queen froze, nearly dropping the calm tool she had been inspecting. She had received tributes, oaths, and flattery sufficient to make the core of a neutron star blush. None of it had ever produced this peculiar stirring, this flutter of consciousness she had no name for. She cleared her throat. "Music of the stars." She repeated, the words foreign in her own mouth, almost tasting sweet, which was an entirely new sensation. "Yes," he said, utterly sincere. "I mean, look at them. They kind of hum, don't they?" He stretched out his hand as if to conduct the invisible symphony of distant solar winds and pulsar rhythms. The Queen blinked, and her mind, normally so precise, so lethal, scrambled. There was no protocol for responding to human compliments, especially not ones that invoked both cosmic phenomena and the shape of her ears. They spent the rest of the transit through the nebula in a series of minor calamities. The human managed to miscalculate the gravlift's pull, float into a control console, and spill nutrient packs, all while explaining, in detail, Why edible synthetic food in zero gravity should not defy the laws of thermodynamics. The queen observed, her stern expression softening with each of his antics. She caught herself laughing, quietly, internally, to avoid alarming her officers, and for the first time in centuries, she did not mind the order of the universe being slightly disrupted by a human's bumbling charm. "You know," she said at one point, voice still carefully measured, "I could have you assigned to menial tasks for the remainder of the expedition." "And miss this spectacular view?" he asked, sprawled midair with a dangling wire. "Never. Besides, who else is going to tell me why your ears are listening to the stars and not me?" The queen tilted her head, a long ear brushing her shoulder, and found herself amused beyond her usual measure. Humor, she realized, was not weakness. It was something far more disarming. And yet, the human soldier had managed it, unintentional and unwitting, while simultaneously undermining centuries of her carefully cultivated authority. By the time the ship emerged from the nebula's swirl, a faint pinkish glow illuminating the deck, the queen had to admit something she would never have confessed aloud in any council chamber. She looked forward to his missteps, to his awkward analogies, and yes, to the way he seemed to see something in her that had nothing to do with fear or obedience. The stars continued their silent dance beyond the hull, but she hardly noticed. She was listening, truly listening for the first time, not to systems, not to fleets, not to strategy, but to something smaller, infinitely more unpredictable and curiously exhilarating. She was perhaps on the edge of something entirely new. A laugh, a real laugh, threatened to escape, and she let it rise just enough to tingle through her ears. She realized she could, perhaps, be more than a queen. She could, perhaps, be simply a woman, navigating the absurdity of human quirks, floating nutrient packs and cosmic cotton candy. And in that strange, uncertain space between power and amusement, she felt alive. The human soldier was late. Of course, he was late. He always seemed to miscalculate time aboard the flagship, even with the chronometers synchronized to the quantum pulse of the ship. The queen, standing at the edge of the observation deck with her long ears angled like fine radar dishes, tapped a clawed finger against the railing. She could feel the hum of the engines vibrating through the floor, a steady, reassuring pulse that reminded her she still ruled this vessel, this fleet, this corner of the galaxy. And yet somehow, she did not feel entirely in control. He floated in moments later, legs bent awkwardly at the gravlift's misalignment, a strap of his harness caught on a console. "Sorry, Your Highness," he said, voice tight as he untangled himself. The time dilation in Sector 3 was tricky." She raised an eyebrow, tricky or incompetent. "Ah, yes," he said, nodding as if conceding a great point. "Incompetent might be more accurate." He tried to grin, but his teeth caught on his helmet strap. She suppressed a laugh, and for the first time considered the idea that humans might possess some innate talent for chaos that even the most sophisticated technology could not smooth. They proceeded down the hall toward the engineering bay. The human tripped on a maintenance hatch, recovering with a flail of arms that sent a toolkit sliding past her boots. "I think I'm going to invent a new form of zero-gravity slapstick," he said, trying to catch the toolkit before it floated into the engine core. "Do not," she said, though her lips twitched despite herself. Her ears flicked slightly forward, a gesture she had learned to use as both intimidation and amusement. Perhaps amusement was dangerous. Perhaps it was contagious. In the engineering bay, they began their inspection of the new subspace thrusters. The queen watched as the human poked at the interface panels with cautious curiosity, mumbling things like, "Why is this panel so shiny? Is it reflective enough to see my mistakes? And I think I just created a self-replicating holographic sandwich, but that's probably fine." The queen tilted her head. He was absurd. And yet, in the absurdity, she found herself laughing quietly, enough for her long ears to pick up the vibration, enough to betray her amusement to the air itself. At one point, he asked if she could show him how to calibrate the gravlift, and when she did, he followed her instructions perfectly, until he decided to test them mid-step, floating 2 meters into the air and flailing like a puppet with cut strings. She reached out, caught him with a precision that would have destroyed a smaller vessel, and deposited him gently back on the floor. "You're lucky I didn't let you crash into the antimatter containment field," she said. "I'm lucky in general," he said, dusting himself off. "Mostly lucky to survive being in the same room as you." She frowned. "I am not your lucky charm." "Maybe not, but the universe seems to think I am," he said with a grin that managed to be both infuriating and oddly endearing. She exhaled a small, irritated chuckle. They continued through the bay, and she watched him as he inspected the thrusters, pointing out inefficiencies in the cooling system, suggesting what he called creative solutions that involved duct tape and recycled hollow projectors. She scowled once, almost imperceptibly, then shook her head. The human, with his audacious incompetence disguised as ingenuity, had a way of drawing her into his orbit. Hours passed with this rhythm. Minor disasters, unplanned laughter, and the occasional disarming compliment. "Your ears really are incredible," he said while floating upside down to inspect a malfunctioning conduit. "I mean it. They're like cosmic antennae tuned to elegance." She froze again, a diagnostic tool in her hands trembling slightly, and he seemed utterly unaware of the impact of his words. "Are you always this careless with your speech?" she asked. "I'm always this honest," he said, floating back to stand properly, harness straps dangling. "And occasionally this clumsy, but mostly honest." She found herself considering the notion that honesty could be as lethal as any weapon in her armory. The warmth from his compliments lingered in her chest like a small, illicit fire. She had conquered empires, yes, but had she ever been truly disarmed by words? She realized she had not, until now. In a brief lull, he leaned against the wall and sighed. "You know," he said, "if someone had told me I'd be floating around in zero gravity with the galaxy's most terrifying ruler, making bad jokes and spilling synthetic coffee, I'd have said they were insane." "And yet here you are," she said, voice softer than intended. Her ears flicked forward, betraying a pleasure in the ridiculousness of it all. "Insane enough to survive the experience, apparently." "Exactly," he said, smiling. "Survival is underrated, don't you think?" The Queen allowed herself to smile as well, carefully controlled but genuine. She realized that survival was not the thrill she had expected it to be. The thrill was this: the unexpected joy of watching a human stumble through her world and not crumble beneath it, of hearing humor in a place where commands usually echoed in perfect precision. They drifted back toward the command center, gravlifts humming beneath their feet, or rather, beneath their floating boots. He attempted to demonstrate a zero-gravity somersault and ended up spinning like a cork in a grav tube, arms and legs flailing, helmet catching a stray light reflection in a way that made him glow faintly pink. She had to bite the corner of her lip to stop herself from laughing aloud, and when she exhaled through her nose, her ears twitched involuntarily, picking up the hum of his laughter, the vibration tickling her senses in a way she could not suppress. "You're quite resilient," she said, once she had managed to catch him again. "Resilient and humble," he said, straightening his harness. "You should try it sometime." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement sparking through her controlled demeanor. "Humble is a human concept. I prefer directness." "Ah," he said, nodding sagely, "but directness is just humble without the guilt, isn't it?" For the first time, she considered that he might be right. Humor, human flaws, and offhand compliments were not threats, they were invitations. Invitations to a different kind of power, one she had never allowed herself to explore. One that did not rely on fleets or fear, but on laughter, subtle acknowledgement, and the peculiar, unpredictable gravity of human affection. By the time they reached the upper decks, the stars outside the viewport had shifted, glittering against the ship's hull. She noticed the human staring at the view again, humming softly to himself, completely oblivious to the way her long ears swiveled to catch the sound. She realized she was no longer thinking of the universe in terms of domination and order. She was thinking of it in terms of moments. Small, fragile, and infinitely amusing moments shared with a human who had, without intention, altered the trajectory of her heart. And so the queen of planets and fleets, the ruler of systems and stars, floated silently alongside a human soldier who had no idea how disruptive he had become, feeling something she had never felt in centuries. A strange, thrilling vulnerability wrapped in laughter, floating in the improbable orbit of connection. The asteroid field stretched before them like glittering shards of glass, tumbling slowly through the void. The Queen's ship threaded carefully between them, engines humming in delicate counterpoint to the drifting rocks. She stood at the viewport, long ears twitching as if they were sensing the invisible currents of cosmic energy, while the human soldier floated beside her, strapped into his harness but still managing to sway lazily from side to side, as though zero gravity were a dance floor instead of a hazard zone. "You realize," he said, pointing at a spinning boulder that caught the light in a way that made it look like a giant gemstone, "that one tiny miscalculation and we'd be asteroid salsa. Not my favorite cuisine." The Queen glanced at him, eyes narrowing, then softened without warning. "You exaggerate," she said, but her lips twitched in a way that betrayed amusement. She had spent centuries issuing commands that shook planets and fleets, yet she now found herself genuinely entertained by the hypothetical culinary fate of a single human and her own flagship. "Maybe," he said, floating closer and nearly colliding with a control panel, "but I like to plan for dramatic flair. Add spice to the job." She shook her head, her long ears brushing her shoulders. The absurdity of him, the lightness he brought into her meticulously calculated life, had become something she craved. She realized that she no longer measured time by the movement of fleets or the outcome of planetary sieges, but by the moments he stumbled into, literally and metaphorically, her orbit. They reached a calm pocket in the asteroid field, a small area where debris had thinned and light from a distant pulsar gleamed in delicate streaks. The human unstrapped himself from his harness and drifted close to the Queen. "You ever just stop," he asked, voice thoughtful, "and wonder what it'd be like to not rule anything at all? Just float?" The Queen paused. The question, so simple, had never occurred to her. She had never allowed herself to consider what it might be like to relinquish control, even for a moment. But the way he floated there, hair and uniform swaying in zero gravity, made her imagine it. To stop thinking of fleets, of systems, of obedience, and just exist in the absurd, chaotic, unpredictable moment. Perhaps she could. "I never stopped," she admitted quietly, startling herself more than him. "And yet perhaps now I should." He grinned, eyes twinkling. "I think the universe would approve, plus it's way more fun this way, less paperwork." For the first time, she laughed openly, a sound that echoed softly through the metallic corridors and the empty space beyond. Her long ears quivered as the sound passed, and she noticed that she did not care if anyone heard. She had never laughed like this, not in council chambers, not after victories, not even in moments of quiet triumph. This laugh was hers, unguarded, human in its freedom. The human floated closer, careful not to collide with her, and held out a small, floating sphere that glimmered with shifting light. "For you," he said, "a little reminder that some things are just pretty. No strategy, no conquest, just beauty." She caught the sphere, studying it as it rotated slowly in zero gravity. Its patterns reminded her of distant nebulas, of stars she had conquered and planets she had claimed. But this time, the sense of ownership was gone. She did not think of domination or power. She thought of wonder. She thought of how a simple gesture, a human's attempt at sharing beauty, could shift something as rigid as herself into something new, something soft. "Thank you," she said. Words that had rarely felt necessary now felt insufficient. But they carried meaning. He nodded, grinning as he floated to the side, watching her study the sphere like a student in a lesson of the cosmos she had never been taught. The journey back through the outer rim was punctuated by minor disasters and light-hearted chaos. He managed to trigger an alarm by pressing a panel that did not exist, spilling synthetic rations in the process, and she found herself laughing despite the potential annoyance. She realized that she no longer measured frustration by the precision of execution, but by the joy that accompanied small, unpredictable moments. Even as the ship hummed and thrummed under her command, she felt her grip on rigid authority loosening, replaced by something infinitely more human. Care, curiosity, and delight. When they docked at the final station, a sprawling hub orbiting a gas giant, the Queen observed her reflection in the viewport. She saw her long ears, her poised posture, the familiar sharpness of her gaze, but it was softened, animated by something new. The human looked at her and grinned, floating backward and catching himself on a nearby railing with a theatrical flourish. "You know," he said, "you could have scared the entire galaxy with just one glare, but I think you like scaring me with smiles now." Her lips curved into a smirk and she allowed herself a small, teasing bow. "Perhaps," she said, "I am learning new tactics." He floated closer, his expression thoughtful yet mischievous. "New tactics are good, keeps the universe guessing." And in that moment, she understood the truth of it. Power had defined her life, yes, but power alone was insufficient. It had taken a human soldier's clumsy honesty, awkward humor, and a single sincere compliment to reveal what she had never allowed herself to feel. The warmth of being cherished, of being seen, and of existing beyond duty, beyond conquest. She had traded nothing in her authority, and yet gained everything in the spectrum of feeling. The Queen turned, leading him down the docking corridor, her long ears twitching in subtle amusement as he stumbled slightly on the grav lift. She offered her hand to steady him, and he took it